He pushed through a patch of the dark brush and entered a small clearing. His men followed quickly. They would need food soon, and he would have to send them hunting. No fires. They couldn't afford... "Hello, Masema," a quiet voice said. He hissed, spinning, his followers bunching around him and pulling out weapons. Swords for some, knives, quarterstaffs, and the occasional polearm. The prophet scanned the dim afternoon clearing, searching for the one who had spoken. He found her, standing on a little outcrop of rock a short distance away. A woman with a prominent Saldean nose, slightly tilted eyes, and shoulder-length black hair. She wore green, with skirts divided for riding, her arms folded in front of her. Fail Ebara, wife of the shadow spawn, Perrin Ebara. "Take her," the prophet screamed, pointing. Several of his followers scrambled forward, but most hesitated. They had seen what he had not. Shadows in the forest behind Ebara's wife, a half circle of them. They were the shapes of men with bows pointed into the clearing. Fail waved with a sharp motion, and the arrows flew. Those of his followers who had run at his bidding fell first, crying out in the silent forest before falling to the loamy earth. The prophet bellowed, each arrow seeming to pierce his own heart. His beloved followers, his friends, his dear brothers. An arrow slammed into him, throwing him backward to the ground. Around him men died, just as they had earlier. Why hadn't the dragon protected them? Why? Suddenly the horror returned to him, the sinking terror of watching his men fall in waves, at watching them die at the hands of those dark friend Aiel. It was Perrin Ebara's fault. If only the prophet had seen earlier, back in the early days, before he'd even recognized the Lord Dragon for who he was. "It's my fault," the prophet whispered, as the last of his followers died. It had taken several arrows to stop some of them. That made him proud. Slowly, he forced himself back to his feet, hand to his shoulder where the shaft sprouted. He'd lost too much blood. Dizzy, he fell to his knees. Fael stepped down off her stone and entered the clearing. Two women wearing trousers followed. They looked concerned, but Fael ignored their protests that she stay back. She walked right up to the prophet, then slid her knife from her belt. It was a fine blade with a cast hilt that showed a wolf's head. That was well. Looking at it, the prophet remembered the day when he'd earned his own blade, the day his father had given it to him. "Thank you for helping to assault Malden, Masema," Fael said, stopping right in front of him. Then she reached up and rammed that knife into his heart. He fell backward, his own blood hot on his chest. "Sometimes a wife must do what her husband cannot," he heard Fael tell her women as his eyes fluttered, trying to close. "It is a dark thing we did this day, but necessary. Let no one speak of it to my husband. He must never know." Her voice grew distant. The prophet fell. Masema, that had been his name. He'd earned his sword on his 15th birthday. His father had been so proud. It's over then, he thought, unable to keep his eyes open. He closed them, falling as if through an endless void. Did I do well, Father, or did I fail? There was no answer, and he joined with the void, tumbling into an endless sea of blackness. Thank you.
All right, question and answer. So it can be for either me or for Harriet or for both, or whatever you want to do. We won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but you can ask questions as you come by, as long as we keep them relatively short. What are you guys interested in knowing? Right here.
What kind of crimes is Baron guilty of?
What kind of crimes is Baron guilty of? Read and find out. The first Rappo, congratulations. All right, next.
I know you talked a little bit about this. What was the most difficult part of this for you in writing these characters?
What was the most difficult part in continuing the story and writing these characters? Two things were particularly difficult. One was keeping track of everyone. and this is because of the exhaustive nature of Robert Jordan's eye for detail. There are over 2,000 characters, I think, or nearly 2,000 characters, named characters in the books. And many of these characters have distinctive voices and distinctive ways of talking, even those who haven't been viewpoint characters. And so it was a challenge. I made good use of the encyclopedia, WOT, Bob Klutz. I don't know if Bob is here, but he's actually a Texan, and it's extremely useful. At one point, this will give you a hint of the sort of level of detail. Robert Jordan's notes are very, very rich and very, very detailed. Harriet has said on several occasions that she believes that there are more words written about the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan than are contained in the series. And so that would put us at about 4 million words worth of information. At one point I was trying to keep track of everyone who was with Perrin. And I was building a kind of cheat sheet for myself to remind myself, written in my own hand, of who was there and how they spoke and how they thought and what their allegiances were. And I thought, well, if there's something, I wonder if Robert Jordan did this, if there's something I can work from of his. And so I emailed the assistants, Maria and Alan, to whom the book is dedicated. They are wonderful. And they dove into the files, which they do. Robert Jordan's notes are spread across dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of different files, where he would think up something, write a few paragraphs and ideas, and then name it something, save it, and that some of them are buried in 5 folders deep. He had his own interesting filing system. This is how creative people work. It makes sense to us, but to someone else, it's just enormously complicated. And they dove in and came back to me a few days later and said, hey, we found this. And it was a file called With Perrin. And I thought, oh, great. This is exactly what I wanted. And I clicked on it and I opened it up, and it was a list of the names of all the Two Rivers folk in Perrin's army who had not yet been mentioned in the books. Okay? So we're talking dozens and dozens of names of people that he might one day use. And so he wrote them all down, and he knew them all. This is the level of detail that Robert Jordan had about the world. And so that was a real challenge. The main thing when I was writing the series that I wanted to do was I wanted to get the character voices right. I knew that I could not imitate Robert Jordan's style. I decided this early on, that I would not try to imitate his prose word for word. That if I if I did so, it would turn into parody, like a stand-up comedian trying to imitate a way a politician speaks. And there would be all the quirks of his language and none of the beauty. Is how it would turn out. So I decided I had to instead adapt my style to the Wheel of Time, and that was a very different thing, at least in my thinking. But I wanted the characters to all feel like themselves. That was the most important thing for me. I felt that if you came to these books, and even if some of the words choices were different, if when you read Rand, Rand felt like Rand, and when you read Perrin, Perrin felt like Perrin, and when you read Egwene, Egwene felt like Egwene, that would overcome everything else. And so the other challenging thing was to get all of the character voices correct, and of them, Avienda and Tuon were particularly challenging, because they're from different cultures that think very differently. Avi was the hardest for me to get right. I actually threw away 2 chapters that I wrote. I tried once, tossed it, tried again, tossed it, and then wrote a 3rd one before it started to work. All right, right there.
This might be for Harriet and yourself. I was curious, what medieval Arthurian texts were in Robert Jordan's library?
Harriet, which medieval Arthurian texts were in his library?
Well, his library was somewhere between 10 and 15,000 books. Downstairs, near his desk, he did not really have Arthurian. He had a lot of mythology.
Okay.
Books on religion, Asimov's Guide to the Bible, Norse, did I say Norse? Greek. You may be aware he once wrote a book about the Cheyenne Indians. That was the name was Jackson O'Reilly. And after a long time, I said, poor old Jackson, he hasn't had any work in a long time. But it was about the Cheyenne Indians losing the corn, which they did. They were farming people, and they kept getting beat up and robbed by their warlike neighbors, and I've forgotten who the neighbors were, and they kept moving and moving.